All right, everybody, welcome to this exclusive Take Hold Studios interview with none other than Dr. Glenn Sunshine. I just want to first say thank you, Dr. Sunshine, for giving us your time.
Well, thank you for having me.
Awesome. I read Slaying Leviathan, his book, which we'll talk about a lot in this interview, about a year ago. Or no, it would have been the end of last year, early of this year. Quite applicable, not only because of the craziness going on in our country in America, but I was in Canada at the time, which is even worse. So it was great. It was a fantastic read. But before we get into that, Dr. Sunshine is, like I said, an author. He's authored other books, which we could reference as well. He's a podcast host, co-host with C.R. Wiley and Dr. Tom Price, the Theology Podcast. He's a ministry leader, which I love the name of the ministry, as we'll talk about probably. Professor Emeritus of Church History and an ordained minister, correct?
Yep.
So, Dr. Sunshine, could you put some meat on those bones and tell people a little bit more about yourself?
Well, just starting off early, I was raised Catholic, encountered evangelical Christianity at age 13, recognized the truth there. So I came to what I would consider at that point a true saving faith, discovered Reformed theology in college and haven't really looked back. I have a bachelor's in linguistics, master's in church history, PhD in Reformation history. Taught at Calvin for 2 years, 27 years at Central Connecticut State University. Started a ministry called Every Square Inch Ministry from the Kuiper quote. And also am, as you said, I'm on the Theology Podcast with Chris Wiley and Tom Price.
Fantastic. Were you a native of New England, or was that a move later?
No, that was a later move. When you're an academic, you go where the job is.
Yeah.
I grew up in New Jersey, although I spent a lot of my adult life in the upper Midwest before coming out here.
Okay. And that was because your post-grad stuff was in Wisconsin, correct?
Wisconsin, also Trinity Evangelical Divinity School, north of Chicago, and my undergrad was from Michigan State.
Oh yeah, all up there. My wife's from Wisconsin, so we know the area well. And then we were in Brooklyn. My last assignment in the Army was at a small base in Brooklyn, so Jersey I got familiar with somewhat. Where in Jersey were you at?
I was in a little town called Verona, which is right in the corner between Montclair and West Orange in northern Jersey, Essex County. Close enough to Newark that my mother commuted in to teach.
Right. Yeah. I think I drove quite a bit around Orange, so I sort of know the area you're talking about. Yeah. A lot of those suburbs are just a train station and a city, and everyone just trains into the city for work. Okay. Awesome. The other books that Dr. Sunshine's written, you guys, and I'm going to put links in the description so that you guys can find them easy. Why You Think the Way You Do. I haven't read this one yet. I think I bought it on Audible to listen to it. It talks about he sort of traces Western thought, and it must be really good because when you look at the reviews, there's non-Christians who really don't like it. And so he wrote good stuff. But also Slaying Leviathan, which is what we're going to mainly talk about on this interview. I highly suggest it. Again, a link will be in there. It's a fantastic read. It's super easy read, but it's just incredible information that the church needs to know. And that's why I thought an interview would be such a good idea. So when you were thinking about writing this book, Dr. Sunshine, what was the impetus? Why write this book?
Well, it actually started under the Obama administration. Okay. The earliest version of this was a series of articles, actually 2 series of articles I wrote over at Breakpoint. The articles have since sort of disappeared. As far as I can tell, they only exist on the Wayback Machine and my computer. So we did a podcast on Protestant resistance theory, and I don't know what the numbers are now, but for quite a long time, it was the most downloaded podcast we did, which said to me, all right, there's a hunger for this kind of information right now. So I pulled out the articles, expanded them, rewrote them, and so on, added a whole lot of extra information in it. And that's where the book came from.
That's awesome. I was one of those that downloaded that particular episode. I remember that was either early Corona times. I don't know if you say the word YouTube, shut your video down, or or throttles it. But I believe, was that episode early in the shutdowns, kind of?
Actually, I think that may have been even before the shutdown.
Okay.
I don't remember exactly where it was. My guess is, though, it had to be before the shutdown, because otherwise I wouldn't have had time to get the book done.
Yeah, that's true. I remember seeing it and thinking how applicable this has got to be. I'm glad these guys are tackling this topic, and obviously all the events of 2020 at the beginning made people aware that this is a very important issue. So getting into the book, this was a person I'd never heard about, and it was super helpful to learn about. But this man, Lactantius, did I say that correctly?
Good enough.
And I never heard of this guy. Why is he important to know about?
Well, first of all, he was a Christian who was the tutor to Constantine's children before Constantine converted to Christianity.
Oh, wow. Okay.
He was a Christian thinker who wrote a book called The Divine Institutes. And in that, he made an argument for religious liberty. Now, he wasn't the first one to do this. He ends up being the most influential, but many of the early church fathers argued that that the state imposing religion doesn't make sense. The way Lactantius framed the argument, worship of God is only acceptable if it's given voluntarily. God is not pleased by forced worship. And because of this, there needs to be religious liberty. People need to be free to practice whatever faith they choose, because otherwise coerced faith is no faith at all.
Right.
And when the Edict of Milan came out, which people mistakenly think made Christianity the religion of the empire, it didn't.
Right.
It's a bit more accurate to say that it legalized Christianity. But to be more precise, what it did is it set up religious liberty in the empire, which had the effect of decriminalizing Christianity.
Right.
The wording of the edict came straight from Lactantius.
Oh, nice. Yeah. So yeah, it's super important, and you never truly hear about it. And you're right. Most people mistakenly think Constantine just established a state religion and established Christianity as the religion of the realm of the empire, and usually that's even used by non-Christians to show the terrible things that that Christendom has done, or whatever. I mean, there's some terrible things later, that's for sure, in history, but usually it's back to that. It's Constantine was this Christian emperor who imposed religion on everybody, Christianity in particular, and we don't want that. That's a terrible thing. None of us should want to go back to that.
Yeah, well, Theodosius I was the one who actually made Christianity the official religion of the empire, but he did it without outlawing paganism. It's a lot like the Church of England is the established Church of England, but that does not mean that other religions aren't allowed. That was pretty much the way they did it in the empire. Right.
So moving forward now to moving forward to the Reformation, we have a guy like Lactantius who, and actually interject Augustine if you think that's needed, but he and most of the church believed in that we didn't need the state to help spread Christianity. You note in your book that that Christianity is one of maybe the only religions that spread vastly without government support. And then we get to again, go back to Augustine if you think you need to, but we get to the reformers, the magisterial reformers, who were doing a lot of their work sort of hand in hand with princes or the civil magistrate of their realm. Can you talk to that a little bit?
Okay, well, let's actually pause at Augustine for a moment, because Augustine's important for a variety of things. The negative side is that he argues that it's legitimate for government to coerce heretics back to the Orthodox faith. He does not accept the idea of coercing pagans or non-Christians, just people who are nominally Christian heretics.
Interesting.
Which is a little bit weird, but anyway, that is going to be the thing that's going to set up heresy trials and all the horrors that follow. The other thing, though, that he does is he's remembered for a number of theological ideas, but for our purposes, the one that was really important is original sin.
Right.
Now, this is an idea that other people had had, but Augustine really just discusses it and analyzes it probably better than anybody else in the early church.
Uh-huh.
And the reason why this is important for government is that original sin says everybody is corrupt or corruptible or both. And that means that nobody can be trusted with absolute power.
Right.
And further, no single institution can be trusted with absolute power, with the net result that government is always going to be a perhaps necessary evil, that you can't, it has to be limited, and there has to be a system of checks and balances in it, because otherwise the corrupt people who are in the government are going to use the government's power to oppress people and to enhance their own prestige, power, and privilege.
I'm already starting to hear some connections with the founding of America with this.
Exactly. We think this idea of checks and balances, which we talk about with a great deal of pride in the American Constitution, we think that's original to the founders. They're actually operating out of medieval political traditions here, which really come out of Augustine.
So did something go wrong with the magisterial reformers?
Well, what happens is through the Middle Ages, there's always a tug of war that's taking place between church and state. We think that the church is imposing itself on everything. It really isn't. There's always a tug of war going on where sometimes the church has the upper hand, sometimes the state has the upper hand, and it's going to vary country by country and so on. But everybody accepted the idea that the church and the state had to work together. And so coming out of this context, when you break with the papacy, the question becomes, what should the relationship between church and state be? And since the Protestantism isn't introduced without the support of the magistrate, without the support of the government, naturally what ends up happening is Protestants begin forming state churches. You have to take into account the cultural context, the historical context where all this stuff is happening. They don't really have any model for the idea that church and state should be completely separate from each other. They always believe that there should be some kind of working together because both of them are here to advance the cause of the gospel.
Right. And I think in Calvin's commentary on 1 Timothy, he specifically says that part of their role to promote the good in society and promote the spread of the gospel, because it's a good thing and they're supposed to reward the good and reward the righteous and that sort of thing, and then punish the evildoer. Well, an evildoer will be someone who's trying to stop the spread of the gospel.
Right.
So fast forward a little bit then to our nation's founding, and in your book you talk about, I believe it's John Locke who wrote Leviathan. And
no. Hobbes wrote Leviathan.
Hobbes wrote Leviathan.
Locke was reacting to people like Hobbes who were arguing for an absolutist state.
Okay. And so then it was Locke. I just got my stuff mixed up. And that wouldn't be the first time. But Locke was the one who he wrote, I mean, maybe I should just hand this to you, but he took religious terminology sort of out of how he would have formulated a government, correct? Can you talk to that a little bit and how that affected our founding fathers, maybe?
Yeah. Well, Locke is a brilliant political thinker, but there's very little in Locke that is completely original. Okay. So how does this work? You get from medieval theories of natural rights the idea that there are unalienable rights. There are rights that we have that we cannot give up and that no one can take away from us. And if you read medieval theologians, you will find them arguing that these God-given pre-political rights that existed before the formation of government, include life, liberty, and property. And I can explain where they come from Genesis if you're interested. So he gets this idea of unalienable rights there. He gets the idea that government should properly consist of a covenant between the ruler and the people, between the government and the people. He gets that from Calvin. Calvin got it from Exodus. When God set up his government in Israel, he did it in the form of a covenant, which, by the way, the people had to ratify 3 times before it went into effect.
Yeah, that's right.
God asks them 3 times, do you accept the terms of this covenant? Yes, yes, yes. Okay, it's ratified.
Right.
So government must be based on the consent of the governed, and it should properly be a covenant with reciprocal responsibilities between the people and the state. Locke is going to take the covenant language or compact language, compact being a covenant, like the Mayflower Compact,
right,
and he's going to secularize it a bit and turn it into contract. But it's still the core idea is still Calvinist.
Right.
From there, you get the idea that government consists of a contract or a covenant between the state and the people, where the people set up the government. Remember, it has to be based on their consent,
right,
with the idea that the government is going to protect their unalienable rights. Should the government violate those rights, the people have the right. This is coming out of Protestant resistance theory, coming originally from Luther, but then through a whole bunch of other people. The people then have a right to revoke the covenant with that king once he's violated the terms, and replace it with another more to their liking. So this gives the right of revolution to the people when the government violates their unalienable rights. Okay. Yeah. All of these ideas are picked up in Jefferson. Okay. And if you want the easiest summary of it, go to the beginning of the Declaration of Independence and read the sentence, and you got to get this punctuated the way it was originally punctuated, which is not the way it's usually done now. Okay. But the sentence that begins with, "We hold these truths to be self-evident." And then there's a whole series of that clauses. Unfortunately, after pursuit of happiness, somebody put a period, and that should be a comma, because there are a series of other that clauses that follow it. Yeah. Those self-evident truths that Jefferson articulates there are the single best concise summary of Locke's political thinking you're going to find anywhere, with one exception. Where Locke says we have a right to life, liberty, and property, Jefferson says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now, the pursuit of happiness, to Jefferson, happiness really goes back to a Greek word, eudaimonia, which in Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics was essentially the purpose of human life. Our purpose was to achieve eudaimonia, to achieve, happiness, which to Aristotle meant a life well lived, a fulfilled life, a good life in every meaning of the word. Okay. Now, Jefferson, so in other words, we have an unalienable right to pursue the purpose of our creation, to pursue the purpose of our existence. And to Jefferson, by the way, that implied the right to property, because you could never achieve eudaimonia. Right. You could never live this kind of life of excellence and virtue without property. So he snuck property in under pursuit of happiness, but he broadened it a bit. Other than that one point, that core statement in the introduction to the Declaration of Independence is, like I said, a great thumbnail sketch of Locke's political philosophy that he articulates in his 2 treatises on government.
What do you say to those who say that because of that they followed Locke and they didn't use specific Christian language like covenant, or that we didn't set up the Constitution to the triune God of the Bible and that sort of thing? So people say we didn't use any of that, so we're not a Christian nation. Well, how do you answer that person?
Let's start off with the fact that all of Locke's ideas come from earlier theologians. And note the word theologians here. They are operating, and they only make sense in a Christian context. It is anything but self-evident that all men are created equal. It is anything but self-evident that they're endowed by the Creator with unalienable rights. All of those things are not self-evident unless you are operating out of a Christian framework.
Right.
Now, Locke was a bit of call him a liberal Christian in his day. Jefferson was a Unitarian rationalist, but they're still operating out of a worldview that is rooted profoundly in the Bible and in earlier theological traditions.
I've heard many people talk about this and how the worldview, just as you mentioned, of the founding fathers of the Western world at this time is Christian, and there's no other way to explain it but Christian. The free markets, the consent of the people, the freedoms and these pursuits. The reason why so many people were fleeing England, I mean, the monarchy had, way overstepped its bounds, and a Christian people understood this to be completely wrong. But that's a Christian world. Is that accurate to say, like, there was no way to almost operate outside of?
Yeah. It's interesting. If you read continental atheists today,
Mm-hmm.
they complain about the British atheists today and call them Christian atheists.
Oh.
Why is that?
Huh.
It's because the British atheists are trying to preserve, as what it was either C.S. Lewis or G.K. Chesterton called, they're living on borrowed capital.
Right.
They've got the remnants of Judeo-Christian morality and so on that they insist that we can hold to and we can live with while being an atheist. The Continentals call them on this and say, basically, no, you can't do that. Because if you're going to get rid of Christianity, you need a totally different foundation for ethics, and this is not what it would look like. Now, why am I pointing that out? It's because the deists and the Unitarian rationalists and so on in this period are still in a world that is so profoundly steeped by Christianity that it's shaping everything that they're thinking, much like the Christian atheists in Britain have Christianity shaping what they're thinking. It's exactly the same thing. It's part of the culture that they're living in, and they can't escape its effects. In a lot of ways, now, by the way, the U.S. Constitution system of checks and balances, as I pointed out before, is based on Augustinian pessimism about human nature and about the tendency of governments to overstep their bounds. The idea of checks and balances comes from the Augustinian political tradition. All of these things are really rooted in Christianity. And I would argue that although there is a move toward more secular language, the U.S. founding documents are the culmination of a 1700-year political tradition. That is really, it's essentially Christian political theology. And it is the final and best statement of that. It didn't develop a whole lot further beyond that, in part because of the French Revolution. The French Revolution is based on totally radical premises, and essentially from that point on, political discussion is invariably influenced by and surrounds the French Revolution in a reaction to it. So in the historic Christian political theology moves at best to the back seat. And it's the radical politics of the French Revolution that really dictate the terms of political discussion from that point on. And it's because of the fact that the French Revolution derailed this that I would describe the founding documents in America as the culmination of that political tradition.
Gotcha. With the event of the French Revolution, and then we move into the 1800s, and we have things like Darwinism come up and really challenge Christian thought. And then from there, it seems like there's kind of a cascade of men come up, Marx and all these things that I feel like right now our culture is truly fighting against, and Christians are really either falling prey to it really fast. A lot of churches are embracing the woke culture, critical race theory, and it's almost like they're forgetting how amazing the beginning of the nation was and what an achievement that really was. If you could show us or tell us maybe some of these highlights throughout history that have brought us today, where these professors in Germany have brought their ideas here and so infiltrated even churches, even conservative denominations.
Okay. Let me start off by noting something that's really important to keep in mind when it comes to wokeness.
Okay.
It's a Christian heresy. that is a surprise to a lot of people.
Yeah.
But even Marx was a Christian heresy. If you look at non-Christian cultures historically, the strong never apologized for strength. They never apologized for oppressing the weak. My favorite example is that during the Peloponnesian War, Athens was going to attack an island with a city-state on it. And the island sent him a note saying, hey, look, we've never done anything to you. We're not opposed to you. We're not fighting you. Why are you going to attack us? This is unjust. And the Athenians, that founding area of democracy, replied, the strong do what they will, the weak suffer what they must. That's the attitude of the world apart from Christianity.
Right.
The idea that we should be paying attention to the oppressed, that we should be liberating the oppressed, that we should help the weak, that we should not take advantage of them. All of these kinds of ideas come from Christianity and Judaism before it. So when Marx comes along and says the workers are oppressed, he's speaking Christian language.
Right. Just to interject, I had a pastor say, people doubt post-millennial thought with the kingdom is always growing. And he said back in the day, ancient times, it was unthinkable whether to help the poor or not, like you just mentioned. But today we fight over how to help the poor.
Right. Yeah.
So continue. Sorry.
Yeah. So we have to start off with that. And that, by the way, explains why wokeness is popular in some circles in the church. It's because they recognize truth there.
Right.
And they know it's wrong to oppress people.
Right.
And since the entire woke movement is built around a language of oppression, it resonates because there is an element of truth there. But the Greek word that we get heresy from is the word hierein, which means to choose. And the idea is that you pick one doctrine that is true, but you grab it and you run with it so far it distorts everything else.
Okay.
So it's sort of like if you got a sweater and you grab one of the threads on the sweater and pull it, the whole sweater distorts. That's the idea of what heresy does. What the woke crowd has done is they have grabbed one idea in Christianity, threw everything else out and run with that one. But the fact that they're running with it means that it can resonate in churches. Now, the key steps along the way, Marx, when the Marxist revolution didn't occur, a guy named Gramsci came along, and Gramsci said that the reason the Marxist revolution didn't work is because of ideology. The ideology of the oppressors was bought into by the oppressed. He called this the hegemony.
Okay.
And as a result, what we need to do is to develop a counter-ideology, counter-hegemony in his words, to awaken people to their oppression. This was then picked up by the Frankfurt School, the Institute for Social Research at the University of Frankfurt in Germany, which, when Hitler was rising to power, went from Frankfurt to Geneva and then ultimately was invited to settle in at Columbia University in New York. And the Frankfurt School creates a movement called the New Left. And if you're my age, you remember language like false consciousness, raising consciousness, and class consciousness.
Okay.
This was the whole agenda of the Frankfurt School, except consciousness really meant awareness of oppression, identifying different oppressed groups, and getting them to realize that they are oppressed, developing a class identity, and then joining with all the other oppressed to ultimately overthrow the system. And they said they would do this via infiltration into institutions like media, education, and politics, where they would gradually infiltrate into them and use them to reshape the culture and reshape society the way they wanted it to be. In the process, by the way, they were also heavily influenced by Sigmund Freud. So you get a kind of Freudian Marxism that ultimately says that the oppressor classes, the foundation of the society that they've created is the family. So in order to change society, you have to dismantle the family.
Yeah.
So you see this, the program is just sort of straight down the new left.
Right.
Now, you got to add some influence of postmodernism in there, some ideas out of feminism and so on. But this is really the way all these things come in. And given that even America, particularly after the Civil War, is heavily influenced by intellectual currents in Europe, where they begin turning away from the Constitution, saying it's a living document. It can be, we can find penumbras and emanations in it to define all kinds of other rights and so on, rather than sticking to the letter of what's written. It allows all of these ideas to seep into the law schools, the Supreme Court, and elsewhere. And so that's been shaping American politics for quite a while now.
And it's working.
Yeah,
that's
very effective.
Yeah, it's very effective. And I was thinking the other day, if someone were to look back and look at all the divorce rates, the LGBTQ movement that has taken off just fine, abortion, and then they look at the biggest best-selling stuff that Christians have done, and they find Left Behind. And it's just like, it's kind of, it's frustrating with the church. Like, come on, like we have the gospel, we have the thing that can bring true reconciliation, that can, that set up a country like we have. And anyway, but that's why we do things like this. We try to help out places like YouTube and whatever else to have content that may help people combat this. So
yeah, let me point out that the one of the main tactics the New Left used is infiltrating institutions. So what we need to do is, at this point, develop alternative institutions to the one that the society that's now effectively controlled by the left.
Yeah.
And that includes particularly schools. Focus on family life, building and creating good, strong families. Churches, of course. Eventually, we want to think about institutions of higher education, although that's going to become increasingly difficult, I suspect, because if you don't buy into the whole program, you're going to lose accreditation. Losing accreditation has got major consequences for a college. But it may be a price we need to pay in order to gradually build the kind of alternative culture that can then take on the existing culture.
I hear you with the accreditation thing, because at some point it's like you either come up with new accrediting agencies that can, vouch for a more conservative Christian way of thinking, Christian worldview that's being promoted by all the schools within this agency, and let the old ones die, let the pagans do their thing, and just let go of it. Because I know for me, I have 3 kids that are 11, about to be 10 and 7. I'm thinking 8 years from now, they're all going to be going off to college, and shoot, what do I tell them? Where do I send them? Sure, I could send them to a secular university and just warn them beforehand and equip them, or send them to somewhere that's not accredited, but who's going to recognize it. Anyway, that's a very important thing to think about when it comes to university in the future for Christians here in this. But when it comes to the critical race theory stuff, what is your top advice for Christians, whether they're parents or not, whether their kids are being, raised up right now in a culture that we are divided, we are not united at all, and that's being pushed on you, even from advertisements in Walmart and Target or wherever. What's your advice here? You called it a Christian heresy. We talked about it a little bit. I guess what I'm trying to ask is, what's a checkmate comment that you can make to, like, here's why you need to beware of this and not give up fighting it?
Yeah, there isn't really a single checkmate comment.
Okay.
What you have to do is ask questions. You have to keep asking the question, why is this the case?
Okay.
When they make a statement, ask why.
Okay.
And what's going to end up happening is the difficulty that we have here is that the true woke people are going to argue that statistics, that logic, that rationality, that science are all examples of whiteness, and that their personal experience and stories trump all of this stuff.
Right. You call this the neo-Gnosticism today.
Yeah,
right?
It's a kind of neo-Gnosticism.
Yeah.
So what ends up happening is, and this is the thing you gotta warn your kids about right away. They're going to tell you all kinds of emotional stories that are designed to get you to agree with them. The problem is, experience is not self-validating, and it is not self-interpreting. And yes, there are tragic stories, but I can tell you tragic stories on a whole lot of sides.
Yeah.
What you need is facts. They would argue that an insistence on objectivity is whiteness.
Right. It's white.
So, but, so the question I would ask is, so why should I consider what you say objectively true?
Yeah, it's good.
If objectivity is whiteness, why is your story objectively more real than my statistics?
Yeah. Well, and if the majority is, the oppressor and the minority is the one that needs to be liberated, what happens when they become the majority?
Yeah. I've argued that critical race theory, critical theory generally, and critical race theory fail when you look at them from a Christian perspective. They fail on their anthropology. They get their doctrine of man wrong.
Yep.
They fail on their hamartiology, which is the doctrine of sin. They get that wrong. They fail on their soteriology, if they even have one.
Yeah.
And they fail on their eschatology. Their future hope is ostensibly a world without oppression. And yet, if you look at what they say, things like racism is natural and inevitable. You can never get past it. What kind of eschatology does that then offer? The best you can offer is to replace one set of oppressors with another.
Yep.
So they fail on all of these counts. And what we need to do is to point out to Christians especially why they can't go there. Now, having said that, there are continuing problems with race. Let's be real here. We have to be honest about this. But we have, within the Christian tradition, we have far stronger and better resources for dealing with the real problems surrounding race than CRT has to offer.
Amen. Yeah.
And that's found really ultimately in the image of God.
Definitely. That's really, really helpful. It doesn't matter where you are. People are constantly bringing this topic up. And just yesterday after service, I barely, mentioned some of this in my sermon yesterday, and several parents came up. I'm so glad you mentioned that, because that needs to be said. And you see it everywhere. And so, yeah, it's pervasive. And so thank you. It's very helpful. And again, I think your book, Slaying Leviathan, really helps too, because you help get rid of the misunderstandings of Romans 13 and the role of the government laid out in the Bible, which everyone needs to read. And then today with CRT and their culture's looking to government to fix everything. They largely don't look to the gospel or anything else. They just look to controlling people, controlling the conditions, right? Controlling the environment, and that will produce the perfect human that we're looking for. So anyway, go get Dr. Sunshine's book, Slaying Leviathan. The link will be there in the comments or in the description. And I wish I had product placement to show you. It's got a sweet cover on it. I bought it on Kindle, so I'd have to show you on my phone. But it was a great read. And Dr. Sunshine, thank you for your time. If there's anything that you want to still plug or share here as we close this conversation, the floor is yours. Oh, and I do have one last question.
Okay, well, let's do your question first.
Okay. On the podcast, you usually get a hard cider, is that right?
That's what I was doing when we were meeting live.
So I wanted to ask, do you have a favorite? I'm in New England, so I might be able to find it.
Down East, unfiltered.
Down East Unfiltered. Okay, I'm gonna write that on my notes here.
I think they're from up in Boston.
Oh, I should have it up here in Maine then. Down East Unfiltered. I like many things, but my wife and I like a good cider when we find one, and there's a lot of different kinds now. So
yeah, unfortunately the best are next to impossible to find. They come from Brittany and France.
oh well, yeah.
You can find cider from Normandy, but you can't find it from Brittany, and Breton cider is really different.
Oh wow, okay. Well, if I ever get to Europe, I'll have to find some.
Yeah, you can occasionally find them here, but they're not the easiest thing to do.
Wow. Okay. All right. Any last words?
Yeah. We need to be careful about the infiltration of wokeness into our communities, into our schools, into our churches, and so on. But the one thing that, when I've talked about this before, the reaction I frequently get is, I'm scared. And I'm here to tell you there's no reason to be scared. Jesus is still on the throne. God is the one who determines the course of history. He determines the rise and fall of nations. And the promise that all things will work together for our good still stands.
That's good.
So even if things get tough, and I expect they're going to be honest with you,
right?
Even if things get tough, God's still with us. He's still on the throne, and he is working his purposes out in history. We can't let this distract us from that fundamental fact.
Beautiful.
The other thing to remember is that Ibram Kendi, Robin DiAngelo, any of these people who are pushing these ideas, they're not the enemy. The enemy is the enemy.
All right.
And we need to think about the people who are pushing these ideas as victims of the Stockholm Syndrome.
Okay.
The Stockholm Syndrome happens when someone who is captured or taken hostage or kidnapped or whatever, and then due to psychological pressures or whatever, end up flipping sides and joining with their captors.
Right.
So the people who are pushing these unchristian ideologies are really people suffering from the Stockholm Syndrome. They're not the enemy. They're the people we're to rescue.
Yeah, they need the truth.
And the only way to do that is to build relationships and to, do what Jesus said to do and love them.
Yeah.
As a couple of final ideas, I would drop those out there for you.
Thank you. That's encouraging, and I know it will be helpful. Thank you so much for your time. It was such a pleasure to be able to meet you in this way, and I hope we can meet in person sometime in the future. And I'm just so happy to be able to talk with you about your book. I really want everyone to get it and read it, and so I hope this makes people go out and go get it. Thank you so much for your time. Everybody else, don't forget to like the video, share it with your friends, share it with anyone who you think would be helped by this. Subscribe to the channel, hit the bell there so you get notified when we put new stuff out. And thank you for watching and listening. We'll catch you next time.